So let's talk a little bit about these elevation certificates. You know, you heard me mention before, they're no longer required. That doesn't mean they don't help. One of the big things with elevation certificates is, does anybody remember how many diagram numbers used to be on an elevation certificate? It was around, I think, 10 or 11. They could be really confusing. It's like you had 2 different types of slab. You had 4 different types of crawl space. Well, they've tried to simplify this really into these 6 areas now, where you don't necessarily have that below grade crawl space and above grade. You just have a crawl space. You've got your elevated with enclosure. Now, elevated with enclosure has been kind of misleading for a few years, especially if you work with a lot of real estate agents. They'll send you a lead, hey, this house has a basement. But FEMA doesn't consider it a basement. FEMA really considers it an elevated with enclosure because it's a walkout basement. So that's kind of one of the things that they've tried to eliminate that confusion as well there too, is having that elevated with enclosure, elevated with no enclosure, especially if you're on the coast, and piers and pilings. And so these big things, let's just talk about the crawl space. If you've got the vents in there, not even if you don't have the vents, as long as there's no living space, so the crawl space now, the next floor up is going to be considered your lowest grade floor. That means that's the level FEMA's using in their data to determine it. Now with these elevation certificate diagrams though, so there's only really 6 diagrams now, so they're really trying to simplify it. Still a little confusing, but it's getting a lot better than it was. So in regards to diagram numbers on elevation certificates, those are some of the changes you're going to see. You're probably going to start seeing those soon with surveyors, because surveyors are getting caught up on these new regulations, but we still have not seen them come in on the elevation certificates with the new diagrams yet. But what's really important to understand is that, hey, say you have a surveyor go and do one of these elevation certificates. They're actually not held responsible for the diagram number. The only thing a surveyor is held responsible for is the actual survey numbers. So it's not uncommon for us to have to call FEMA to get them to correct the diagram number, as long as it's not the elevation numbers that are wrong. Now, I've seen surveyors where they will accidentally shoot the wrong numbers and put them on those. That part they can be held responsible for. But usually when you reach out to them, they'll see the error and they'll want to fix it simply from an E&O standpoint. As I said, we talked a little bit more about elevation certificates. When they're required, they're not. Risk Rating 2.0 still uses elevation certificates. You have 2 options here. You can use the elevation certificate or you can use FEMA's data. Now, what we've seen so far is that FEMA's data is off still 30–40%. Compared to an elevation certificate. And one reason is that they're shooting all these different things. They're using all these technology things, Google Earth, Google Maps. But at the end of the day, a human putting their hands on that risk is still going to be the most accurate. So replacement costs, as I said, we've talked about a little about this on premiums. I'm trying to go back on these elevation certificates. Let's see if it'll let me go back. There we go. So in elevation certificates, one other thing I want to show you too is, let's say that you go and help someone who doesn't have an elevation certificate. They decide to get one 4 months down the road, and you decide to submit it to the National Flood Insurance Program. It can actually benefit them, and FEMA will actually go back to the effective date, put the elevation certificate on there, and actually prorate the policy. So in case someone's wanting to get that, you know, when I was telling them, there's really no way to know if it's going to be beneficial until it's actually done, unfortunately. I mean, sometimes it can be a big waste of money. But it's important to know that, hey, the policy can actually be prorated based on the elevation certificate when it comes to having these in a system. So just because they're not required, don't think they're not going to be beneficial anymore, they're not going to help anymore. Another area is, does anyone know where to find an elevation certificate if one's been done? So usually you can go to the county. Now I will use Florida as an example. I wish every state did it like Florida did. Florida actually requires elevation certificates to be on file for every county except for 2 counties in the entire state, which can be beneficial. So if it was like a new construction a few years ago, the zoning department might have it. Other than that, the current property owner might have it, or the surveyor who did it, if you can track that down. Those are really going to be the ways to get it. But the great news is when it comes to elevation certificates, you're no longer getting that message of, hey, we can't give you a quote because of an elevation certificate.